So welcome to another set review of MSEM. This time we're talking about Karina's Explorations, the new set coming out alongside Valinov, and might as well jump straight into it, talking about lands first.
Lands. We all love lands. Every set comes with their own land cycle, and this time we have man lands, except they also explore.
So basically the short list is that they explore an ETB, but they also ETB tapped, and they're also man lands, which is a lot of things for a land.
Well, actually, no, they're not just man lands. They're lands that permanently become man, so they're like even manlier than normal man lands.
And they even become mans entirely. They're not even still lands, which is funky.
They can still tap for mana, though, because they don't actually have a basic land type.
Just kind of something unusual. That does mean that they're hit by something like Pithwilt, unlike Monument of Queens.
But if your opponent's pithwilting these guys, I think you're pretty happy.
They'll come with 4 stats. The green and the white one only cost 4 to animate, so those strike me as better, but probably not a big deal regardless, just because they're creatures indefinitely. I think maybe the bigger question is how valuable the Explorer is, because if you play this turn 1 and it hits a land, or any of them turn 1 and it hits a land, I think you're incredibly happy regardless of whether they become a creature or not.
So you play you play a tap land that draws you a card.
And then you discard your Fate Stitcher, because you're on the draw, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Also, even if they don't hit a land, the man land does become even manlier. It does mill you one, which isn't too bad.
Well, actually,
so you can mill your Fate Stitcher.
For the black man land, if it doesn't hit a non-land, then it just doesn't become a man.
Yeah, imagine the black man land is weirdly the worst because of that, even though black is one of the colors that can make use of mill the best. So even worst case scenario, these are kind of monocolored temples that turn into creatures, and temples definitely were pretty good.
I mean, actually, I'm pretty sure the worst case scenario is you play these guys late game and they flip a land that you don't need and you can't even animate them because, for example, the black one.
So the white one is still pretty good, even if it doesn't get the counter. This is an 0-4.
Yeah.
Blocks pretty well. I'm going to imagine that these are actually really good. The white one, the green ones especially. So the green one does have fairly tough competition with Lumbering Hillock.
Well, Lumbering Hillock doesn't draw you a card.
It is fetchable though. And there's definitely a real cost to your land ETB being tapped. So admittedly, there is a fair amount of utility with the fact that they slow dredge you fast. If that makes any sense.
Oh, sure.
Honestly, there might be a real argument to like intentionally going on the draw. If you play 8 of these, you go turn 1, this, you have like 40% to hit a land, then you discard hand size, discarding your big threat.
Sure.
Turn 2, play interaction, turn 3, reanimate.
How do you play interaction when you're playing 8 of these lands and they're going to come into play tapped?
I mean, you play your Descend on the Helpless or whatnot. So the fact that they might be able to not require discard outlet is pretty attractive. And even if you whiff turn 1, you can just play another turn 2 and try again, which is kind of funny.
They require you to not mulligan.
I guess that is pretty true, which is some downside. But maybe instead of playing like 10 or 12 discard outlets, you can get away with 8. And I mean, they do mill ones. If you hit a land, you can slow dredge something with land. Or if you hit what you want to dredge, you can just mill it.
If you hit neither,
then you play another one next turn. Presumably you'd still want some backups, so like wheat from chaff, but it means that you maybe don't have to go all the way on discard. I don't know if you want these regularly. Maybe the white one could see some play, or the red one, since those are pretty common monocolor decks. The other ones maybe seem a bit riskier, but not sure, because Skylands are really good. Moving forward, we have another land, which maybe is even more scary, in Implant Greenhouse, which makes 3 mana.
Hey, it's like old Kelly Thrash's Workshop.
There's a question of what you want to use for this, because you do kind of need to be playing advanced on deck. And there's some support for it with Experimental Power Source also reducing advance costs. They don't work together really well. I think really the 2 cards you're trying to use with it is Inconspicuous Loxodon and Valir Constructed Angel.
Yeah, because both of these guys have 3 colorless in their advance costs.
So Amelia is a bit slow still, since Inconspicuous Loxodon does cost 5. Valir costs 8 if you want to advance her, but it might be worthwhile even. Definitely we've seen with Polyp Pools that this kind of effect is pretty cheap and worthwhile.
Not even with Polyp Pools, like Jade Temple before it was nerfed. That thing made 2 mana on a land, and it even required you to play another land that doesn't really do much. Somehow that was still broken. Yeah,
Jade Temple did have much less strict requirements for payoffs though, where it could play literally any monocolored card that costs 3 or more, whereas here we need really specific cards from Karina's Explorations.
Well, the good news is Karina's Explorations is a really high-powered set, so maybe there's something good here.
Yeah, I think unfortunately it is just Inconspicuous Otter and Villia Construct Angel. Stuff like Tireless Archivist is also potentially good enough. It does search for any card, so you can even fetch another Implanted Greenhouse. So you
Right.
can go like turn 3 Tireless Archivist, turn 4 Villia.
How are you getting your colors?
You could play a filter land.
Uh,
I mean, presumably only playing 3. It is a bit annoying though, definitely. But again, getting Valera out very fast is really scary because she comes down, she's a Sarah Angel with lifelink, basically wipes your opponent's board, and then she does it every turn afterwards too.
like how do you beat that? You have to kill this thing or else you never get bored.
I mean, you do need to find a way to get implanted greenhouse, and unfortunately, the green that tends to find lands is not present in a lot of the advanced stuff.
Yeah.
But even then, maybe you do it anyways. I mean, Valera is an angel. If you want to play Verida's Disciple, I guess.
Oh,
So maybe playing
God.
Polyp Pools and implanted greenhouse is going a bit too far. And I
Yeah.
mean, Inconspicuous Otter, 2 mana, 1/4. Not the craziest thing. Probably not good enough on its own, though. You can play like Gate of Realms, though, to fetch it. There's also like some random other stuff that you can advance out, like Plush Tea Party.
What does that thing even do?
So you go like turn 1 Plush Tea Party, and then turn 2 advance Plush Tea Party. Then turn 3, you play another Plush Tea Party, and then you advance that one too.
Okay, so
Crazy.
what? So you get a bunch of plushies getting your life each turn.
But I mean, look at how cute those sharks are. You can get like 3 sharks per card.
Right, and then I mean, what's your opponent going to do against your pillow fort of literal plushies, right?
Nothing. They can see.
Yeah.
So now we've established that Implant Greenhouse plus Plush Tea Party is the broken combo. We can move on.
Yeah.
So we have Better Together, which I don't know what this card does actually.
Well, first of all,
Cool.
I'm not even sure if this works within the Magic rules. Like how much
Seems reasonable enough.
like how much finagling do they have to do to get this thing to work?
Probably not very much. I mean, there's some stuff in Magic that does some pretty wonky stuff. Isn't there a card that enchants the graveyard?
Everything in Canon Magic so far only enchants a single thing.
No, you're enchanting 2 things.
Okay.
The question is, what do you like actually do with this?
I'm assuming the flavor here is that you're supposed to stick it onto a planeswalker, so then you can activate a planeswalker and then put loyalty counters on the other one.
Yeah, I guess that works. You can also put Planeswalker plus creature or something.
Yeah, like just pair people together. The most flavorful combo in this set is Karina and Anna because I think that's what the art is trying to depict.
You can also do stuff like put it on a vehicle plus something else.
Oh yeah, that actually works pretty well. So like you stick on the vehicle plus its pilot. Those two are like bonded together.
Ship someone with the ship. But yeah, this card pretty clearly does something, though figuring out what it does might be a bit tough. Moving forward, we have Devotee of Winds. 7 cards in your graveyard is a lot, but maybe this is worthwhile.
I play against this thing. It wrecked me because I played against a deck that had this guy plus the Nether Muck Bruiser. I think it actually did work out pretty well because once you get 7 cards in the yard, it just keeps growing.
Yeah, imagine once you get up to 7, then exploring every turn does make it pretty fast. If you hit lands, I guess it's not great. I guess it'll just draw them. So if you do hit non-lands, then you mill, it gets bigger, so you get closer to again 14. You can use it with like the Nether Muck Bruiser, as you mentioned. And then eventually you get to 14, and then it really starts getting scary. Milliard is kind of wrecked by Grave Hate in a way that like Nether Muck Bruiser isn't as much, since 2/3 for 2 is better than a flying man generally. And then of course all the things that mill you probably also apply, so like Endless Helpless Souls.
The new EHS that mills.
Yeah, I think otherwise it does mostly the same thing as Muck Bruiser. I don't think you want this in flyers or anything. So moving on, we have Distraction Doll. And I think this card's actually really efficient, like shockingly so. Maybe it's not a main deck card, but it feels like it approximate 1 mana exile target creature a decent amount of the time.
Also, it's a first exposure to First Contact. So how reliably can you trigger First Contact?
I imagine reasonably reliably. Maybe it's not ideal if you have like a bunch of 4s, but I don't think most of the decks I would want this are playing a bunch of 4s.
I think most of the time First Contact is just going to be like every turn you put a counter on it.
Yeah, probably. Or at least most turns you put a count on it. Maybe decks with like milling don't do it as consistently. And there's probably some odd times that you don't, but I think with Distraction Doll, since you only probably need to get it to like 2 to be good,
Is it?
it's probably pretty reasonable.
One man exile something that costs 2?
Yeah, but you can do it in advance. Like you play this on turn 1, and then when you need to kill a 2-drop, it's free.
Right.
It does kill like tokens, of course, always. It is also an artifact for things that care about that.
Yeah, and I guess it exiles 2.
Yeah. So it does do quite a few things. I think just the fact that you can kind of store up removal is really nice. Where like that's definitely an advantage to like Storm Surge if you're playing in more fair decks, where you can orchestrate Storm Surge, play a Planeswalker, Storm Surge whatever your opponent has to make the Planeswalker safer. And Distraction Dog kind of does that too, but in a better way.
Yeah.
Might be a sideboard card just because it only hits creatures, and playing removal that only hits creatures isn't generally the best main deck, but sideboard seems pretty reliable. Actually, even against decks without any creatures, a lot of those play Bounty the Gardens, so maybe it's even worthwhile there.
Absolutely Rex Bounty, yeah.
Moving on, we have first card with Codex in Forgotten Library, which gets a bunch of lands in a library.
Yeah. Is there anything else to say? Oh yeah, first exposure to Codex too. Codex is a very interesting mechanic introduced in this set because, in MSEM we have extra libraries. That's the thing we do here. On Cockroaches, we can also just conjure cards. So Codex is the combination of those two things, where we conjure cards into our second library.
Forgotten Library, I think you definitely do need to be doing something unique with it. So puts in the library 6 lands, all the tri-lands are made green, as well as Into the Woods. So some kind of like basic way to make use of it is what the card kind of suggests in Explore, the mechanic, not the card. Though you can probably use the card too to make sure that you can explore land hand, which isn't bad. But you can also do kind of more funky things like play Procedural Genesis for one if you want.
What's that do?
Well, it gets you all the lands up to Into the Woods. Huh. So if you can manage to get Into the Woods out of the library, you
can deal with the trigger ability that lets you stack your deck when you explore.
You can do that either with the Explore lands that we talked about earlier, or if Into the Woods are just near the top. So like if it's one of the top 2 cards, then you can just draw to it.
Or you can just use its activated ability to force you to explore.
And then you have a library full of lands, which I think Procedural Genesis is the main card that kind of makes use of this. But there are definitely others that like you having a land on top. Something like Pedo, where it looks at top card and you guess whether it's land or non-land. Obviously it works very well with this.
Actually, doesn't Pedo work well with any sort of codec because you just know what's on top?
Yeah, definitely. There are a pretty limited amount of codexes, and this is the one that's kind of guaranteed to have stuff that's at least somewhat useful.
Lands? I mean, lands are bad in the late game.
Are useful. Definitely stuff you can do with this card, just with the fact that it lands on top. So moving on, we have a whole bunch of equipment with adventures, starting with Hand of the Fallen, which is kind of funky, where the adventure is pretty good removal, +2/2 for 2 mana. Oh, not good, but like acceptable.
It's almost like Bonecrusher Giant. It's 2 mana, deal 2, right?
Pretty close to it. Isn't an instant unfortunately, but also the equipment is interesting. It's kind of like Menace plus Double Strike almost. Double Strike -1, but doesn't have First Strike.
I mean, 2 to equip isn't too bad.
Yeah, 2 is kind of cheap. Not too cheap, but definitely equipping this is pretty reasonable. Similarly, we have Token of Tribulation, which is pretty close to the same card almost.
It's removal on an adventure, and then you have really cheap equipment that's really easy to move around.
Yeah, this would probably end up being better than Hand of the Fallen for a couple reasons. First of all, this works really well with Dawnhill Forgemaster. I thought all these work super well with Dawnhill Forgemaster.
Like, I feel like Dawnhill Forgemaster just gets better every set. Like, in Onara, it was already pretty decent, fetching all the cantripping equipment, and then in Quest for a Roseblade, now it's fetching Chevalier's Lands, and now with these sets, it's fetching literally spells.
Definitely with both of the ones we've looked at, the fact that the adventure is 2 mana is kind of spooky because you can go turn 1, fetch it with Dawnhill Forgemaster, turn 2 removal, and then you have 2 things in exile, then just remove something your opponent played. Token Tribulation also works really well with Dawnhill Forgemaster because Dawnhill Forgemaster really likes +1/+1 counters.
Again, it's super cheap, so you can easily get onto Dawnhill Forgemaster because Dawnhill is also pretty cheap.
Also, if you're playing like Swan Cohort, you can sack it, which is nice.
It goes in the same deck as Dawnhill Forgemaster.
The white one of the cycle, which might be the most important because Dawnhill Forgemaster is white, is Aegisul, the Sunspear.
This adventure is the most underwhelming of the bunch.
Yeah, the equipment is quite a bit better, but provided you have a spirit, of course.
Which comes along with the adventure.
Yeah. So if the spirit dies, it does become a bit awkward because you need to find a way to get another spirit.
Just Dawnhill another one.
I guess that's fair, but it is legendary, so maybe you don't want to play multiple.
If you have extras, you can just adventure them.
I mean, I'm not super excited about playing a 3-mana 1/1 flyer.
Hey,
but the equipment is good enough that maybe it is just worth it. There's probably some other ways to make spirits.
Infectious Ego is a spirit.
Oh, you know what you can do with it? You can play Polyp Pulse.
Oh.
That's the best spirit in the format.
Oh, huh.
You can also play the format staple Fox of the Orange Orchid.
Not a spirit?
Yeah, Fox Spirit.
Amazing.
I do think Aegisul probably has some utility outside of Thornhill Forgemaster, though maybe you just always want to play with Thornhill Forgemaster.
Thornhill's a good card. Might as well play it.
Also, just like +3/+3 to Thornhill Forgemaster and Vigilance is pretty nasty.
This thing occurs pretty well with Thornhill. Like, you turn 1, fetch it out, turn 2, play Thornhill, turn 3, adventure it, and or you equip it, Thornhill, and start swinging with double striking 4/4.
Yeah, and that's just a single card curve. But you can also just go like end of turn, play the adventure, and do your opponent's turn, untap, play this, equip, swing for 4. Even something like a white-based control deck might just want this, because that kind of play pattern's pretty nice. 4/4 Vigilance, Flyer is pretty nasty, even if you're paying, I guess, 3+2+1.
Yeah.
Moving forward in the cycle, we have Cartographer's Step.
Adventure, it's basically Sylvan Scrying.
Yeah, it doesn't fetch duplicate lands, so can't fetch like multiple Pollock Balls up, but still pretty respectable.
If you're playing Sylvan Scrying, you're usually fetching a land they don't already have.
Yeah, probably. Maybe this does work in like Heart Attack.
Yeah.
Competes with like Gate of Realms. Yet again, the equipment is really nice with Thornhill Forgemaster. If you really want to be ridiculous, you can go turn 1 Thornhill Forgemaster, turn to a turning map, fetch the land with an adventure, and play adventures for the first 3 turns of the game off 1 card.
The equipment side is probably the worst one out of all of them because it costs 3 and 3. You can't move around as freely.
Yeah, though, it is a really huge equipment. It's probably not unreasonable for it to be like +6/+6. Even putting it onto like a Cane Dancer is pretty large.
Or, put it onto a bounty token.
If you're playing it in like a Hotter Zerdina type deck, maybe this takes some pressure off playing actual win conditions. And maybe you can just get away from like equipping this onto a Monument of Queens, since that sounds pretty nasty.
Have enough mana for that?
Hotter Zerdina makes a lot of mana.
Right.
Only costs 7 once you have it in play. That's 8 because you need to attack with Monument of Queens.
Yeah.
But that requires, 6 lands? Last card on this cycle is
Hyle's Gift,
which wants you to have other equipment, which, well, if you're playing Dawnhill Forgemaster, you probably do. The adventure is really interesting.
Get out.
Yeah, target permanent phases out.
Just say get out as you cast this on anything.
Of course, you can use it, protect your own creatures from removal. It also protects from edicts, which is unique, particularly if you're trying to do something more boggly. So, like, it's actually pretty good in multiples because it costs so much to try and kill it, and then you can get out your own guy. Also, you can use it, take your opponent off mana for a turn, which is kind of neat. Phase out the land in upkeep, which might be relevant if you're playing around like a Rot or a Singularity's Grasp. You can turn 4, phase out the opponent's land.
Yeah, and that actually distinguishes it from Rest, which only phases out non-land permanents. And I mean, Rest actually stopped playing combo decks just to turn off something for a turn, like your opponent's hate piece.
This doesn't draw a card though, so not quite as good in decks that don't care about the equipment. Speaking of, there's a bunch of nice Voltron/Boggles pieces in Karina's Explorations, starting with Inconspicuous Sheep and Rose of Sunspear, which I'll talk about in the same breath because they're kind of similar. So Rose of Sunspear has lifelink and haste, and makes stuff cheaper to equip to it based on power, and Inconspicuous Sheep. Once it's equipped, it's a 3/3, and the cost reduction is always the same. But it does also affect ores, if that's relevant. So cheap, you want to be playing stuff that puts abilities on it, whereas Rose of the Sunspear, you just want size, more or less.
Unfortunately, these guys don't actually protect themselves, so you will have to do some protecting for them.
Fortunately, there are 2 pretty good pieces that work with both them in Ring of Souls and Cinderblade. Ring of Souls gives Hexproof and Unblockability, because you're on a 2/2, but you're playing Boggles at this point.
I mean, Rose has lifelink, so you can just negate the 2/2s whacking you.
Cinderblade gives haste, so if you want to talk about like potentially not drawing, you go turn 1 Inconspicuous Sheep, play Ring of Souls, Cinderblade, equip both. Inconspicuous Sheep is now Agent S, 3/3 attack for 3, and then start suiting it up with Hyle's Gift on turn 2, playing the equipment, attack for 6, and yeah, your opponent starts to look more and more dead.
Like, you can just hold up Hyle's Gift to protect against the edicts. It's not like they can even stop you with the edicts at that point.
Yeah, definitely. For the few decks that are playing Excellent, that's definitely a very important point. You also have like some relatively nice tools for equipment deck and like Alenian Warhammer, which is kind of like a very cheap Hyle's Gift if you just want more density for that effect. There's also Inconspicuous Platypus from the same set, which another adventure card, another Inconspicuous card.
It creates a gadget, except it's actually not what is gadget because the set that gadget was from isn't in the format, so it's spelling everything out instead of using the keyword.
So Gear Up is kind of interesting because it is pretty expensive, but Flying, Vigilance, and Ward 2 are all potentially very powerful abilities. Prowess 2 at times, though. May not always. And Inconspicuous Platypus is kind of a good backup. Boggle, 3/3 unblockable. If they're equipped, is pretty solid for 2 mana.
Yeah.
This card, we have Impulse Module, getting out of the equipment stage into artifacts. I guess I should mention that all the equipment are artifacts. You can sack them to Dawson or whatnot. So Impulse Module is a 1 mana artifact that cantrips. So you know what that means.
What does that mean?
That means that you exile it to box.
Ah, I see.
And you're pretty happy about that. Also works pretty well as a mana sink, since it does start exiling quite a few cards, so you can start using it as card selection.
Why don't you play one of those cards?
It feels probably good enough for what you want it for. Like if you're playing box, you don't need an incredible mana card selection or a card draw. Like maybe you just use this to find box. So like turn 3, you advance this, finds you lands, searches towards a box. Next time you advance it, it's searching 3, so on and so forth.
Yeah, until you find your barks, and then you barks this thing.
Yeah.
Then bark starts exiling this top card of your deck, so now you're just impulse drawing through the rest of your deck again.
Yeah. And if you really want to go crazy, you can Mystic Parliament and go even nutser on card advantage. But yeah, I think it's just generally efficient. I mean, we did see Possibility Engine see some play. And this is relatively similar in what it does. A bit less efficient on upfront, but better card in late game.
Moving on, we have Little Pig and Big Adventure.
I think a big part of the reason this card is remotely relevant in Constructor is because of a rules quirk with adventures. So if you're playing something that casts a card for free, then you can also cast its adventure for free, provided the card itself meets the conditions. So most normally, Tower of the Sky fetches a green creature card on your deck that costs X or S. So you do X equals 1, 2 green and 1, fetch the Little Pig, cast a Big Adventure, get 2 lands. Next turn, play another land, you have 6 mana, coalesce Tower of the Sky for another Little Pig.
And
get a 5/5 and 2 more lands.
The imagery is quite funny. Little Pig towering over you.
And then Little Pig is also pretty nice in late game, because those 2 Little Pigs that went on the adventure are actually 1 mana 3/3s once you get the chance to cast them, which is a pretty good stat line. You can also do this with Endless Helpless Souls. Also, Endless Helpless Souls, after the changes, works well with coalesce cards like Tower of the Sky, also with X spells like Tower of the Sky, so you can put it to hand. Also, I guess I should mention that Tower of the Sky also casts EHS, because it can also fetch Revelations.
Oh, wait. Huh.
So you can really go nuts in this. And then, of course, you're getting all this mana, so you can then coalesce EHS.
And then what do you grab off the coalesce EHS?
Tower of the Sky.
Then what do you grab with Tower of the Sky?
Little Pig.
And then, wait, I thought you were supposed to grab EHS there.
No, you fetch EHS off the coalesce Tower of the Sky.
Right.
Because at that point you have 10 mana. You've played Big Adventure like 4 times.
I don't feel like it's a Big Adventure anymore after going on it 4 times already.
Every adventure is a big adventure to Little Pig.
Yeah.
Moving on to something a bit more low to the ground, we have Waste Scrambler, which is just kind of an efficient card.
Yeah.
1 mana 2/2 vehicle, crew 1. If you pay Mardu colors to advance it, then it advances 3 times. So if you play this for Mardu colors, it can be a 4/4 or a 3/3 vigilance or some combination of keywords that you want, which makes this get pretty big, pretty evasive, pretty quickly.
You can't just keep putting +1/+1 counters onto it.
There's a point where it becomes big enough that you probably should be putting Trample instead. It's like, even at just paying Mardu twice for it.
It's already an 8/8 at that point.
Moving forward, we have Ancient Treasures. So this fetches a bunch of really broken cards, most notably of which I think is Earthcraft and Dream Halls. Mind that Earthcraft is banned in Legacy, and maybe that should give it a good idea of how powerful this card is.
Well, I mean, so how are you going to grab Earthcraft off this thing? Because you can't draw cards from this guy's library, right? So you have to explore.
Well, conveniently, there's a set of very easy cards that explore that also fit in every deck because they are lands.
Ah, okay. So what? You play this thing, you have to have something to explore, and then you grab Earthcraft, and then you combo.
Yeah, sounds good. You can also fetch it off like Sea Prophecy or these other kind of draw spells that don't draw. I think you can also sacrifice Ancient Treasures, so you remove the you can't draw from this Codex's library condition.
And conveniently enough, we just got a set that has things that let you stack other things with Vials and Finev.
Yeah, so there's quite a few ways to get the cards. Though admittedly, it is kind of hard to make use of every card in the Codex. So like Dream Halls is another card in the Codex, which probably doesn't go in the same deck as Earthcraft, probably. Though admittedly, it's such a broken card that probably doesn't matter.
I mean, is Dream House breakable in MSEM, though?
Maybe?
It's 5 mana.
I guess that's True. I think the Earthcraft is really the thing that you want to be getting off this.
Yeah.
Because Earthcraft is pretty ridiculous. And I think it plays well into what deck could play a 2-mana enchantment reasonably easily.
But so like you play Wall of Ivy on turn 1, and then turn 2 you play this thing, and then next turn you sack it, the Vial.
I think you'd prefer to have a Explore land if possible. But just find a way to get Earthcraft and then play a whole bunch of nasty, cheap creatures that keep on tapping lands and
Do what Earthcraft used to do in Canon Magic.
then maybe play even like Raise Reinforcements to untap your creatures. Wow. And that gets you 8 mana because you have Earthcraft in play.
You need basics,
Wowza.
and you're in 3 colors.
I mean, you'll need 1 basic for Earthcraft, really. Well, I guess maybe 2, depending on what you're trying to cast. You could probably make use of the other cards in the library. Maybe not as easily. I mean, Energy Field is a funky card.
Why is Energy Field mentioned in the same breath as Earthcraft?
There's also like Enchantress's Presence.
Yeah, why is it in the same bucket as Earthcraft?
They're all enchantments that are kind of broken at times, maybe.
Energy Field ever been broken? Nothing even do. Why is this
I mean,
card good?
If I had to make a guess, you'd play it with Rest in Peace in Canon.
Oh, okay. Do we have a Rest in Peace effect in MSEM?
Mysteries of Uluk does it temporarily.
And Eldrazi Constriction is also in that list.
Chances are you might want to be trying to make use of these other cards, but probably not necessary, because Earthcraft and Dream Halls are pretty crazy combo cards. So moving on to another combo card in Gods of Whimsy. This card is pretty bonkers, because it is Chart the Vast, except 2 mana, kind of. And Chart the Vast is insane. This is probably also insane. Particularly with cost reduces, it becomes really nasty. Because you can also play lands, that gives you another kind of look at it. So just kind of like land instant sorcery is probably the easiest for most decks. Is a 2-mana draw 3 kind of. You just get to look at 2 more cards. If you work the rituals, it becomes even nastier. If you combine it with stuff like rare lines, it becomes even nastier.
But what are you doing with all that mana and cards?
Winning the game somehow, however you want.
No Unseeking Flames?
Yeah, so you can do basically whatever the hell you want. Depends what your deck is. So yeah, Unceasing Flames is pretty good with this, since looking at 2 cards gives you a pretty good shot at hitting Unceasing Flames if you've cast it a couple times. If you have 8 in your deck or so. It also helps you find it. Again, if you play like land or rail line and then like instant sorcery, then you're looking at 8 cards, which is a lot of cards.
Yeah, and you're casting 4 of them, right?
You do need to put some effort into building around this, but I think as long as you're not on like 20 of the same card type, you're probably fine. Like something like 15 or so of one card type is probably just fine. Probably want to cast those later if possible. Even something like land plus 2 of the same card type is really good. There's some restrictions in there. So moving forward, we have Here With You, which...
Cute. Yeah, that's nice flavor text. It's a Punisher card.
It's a Punisher card, but the numbers are like huge, like really big. 2 mana, draw 4. 2 mana, make 4 1/1s. Maybe this is a trap, but like
2 mana
4.
2 mana making 4 1/1s. That feels like not that good. I mean, we have a card that already makes 4 1/1s for 2 mana at instant speed, even.
Well, that requires a couple of conditions. This is like 4.
You could play like Seek Lostchild into Seek Lostchild plus a fetch crack.
Well, not anymore. You can't.
Oh,
I mean, like 4, man. Like 4.
Is this like the most efficient version of this now?
The opponent can give you 4 cards instead. They also get 2, but like 4, man. Like that's a lot of numbers.
Do you want to draw 4 cards if it lets your opponent draw 2 cards? Like, is that even good?
Well, I mean, it's an instant, so
okay, right.
Every opponent's turn, yeah.
But like, what deck wants 4 1/1s that would also be alright with 4 cards? That isn't just a burn deck, but I don't think burn wants 4 1/1s. They want burn.
I mean, maybe there is some red tokens deck. I mean, Artie's Invocation got changed.
Right, like, so you walk straight Artie's Invocation, you play this, and then you look your opponent in the eye, and
they say, draw 4 cards.
Okay, yeah, but at least you drew 4 cards from that, right? But they get 2 cards, so like you're only going +1.
Yeah, but so then you untap, and then you like play another Artie's Invocation, and then you do it again.
Okay.
And you look at your opponent's eye, and you draw another 4 cards.
And then you just got hand size.
Yeah, exactly. And you just drew 8 cards, and the opponent's shivering in fear as they kill you. The numbers on this are like massive. Where like 4 is a huge number in Magic. In constructed, 4 drops have to be like exceptionally good. 3 drops can be like solid and still playable. 3 cards is like good. 4 cards is like pushing it.
5 cards is Dream Sight.
Yeah, 5 cards is like starting to be overkill.
5 cards is something you have to go out of your way to build a 100 card deck for.
4 1/1s is kind of to the point where like an anthem and your opponent starts to look dead. And there's also Dawnhill Outskirts, which is like a really basic anthem, like +1/+0, most basic anthem you can think of. I mean, if you have 4 1/1s, you're dealing 8. But yeah, basically 4 is a big number. That's all there is to say.
I think we spent way too long on a card that's probably not playable.
What? But 4 is such a big number. So moving on, we have Swipe Secrets, which is a very interesting card, where it's kind of a race to get to the card. Normally you'd lose the race because it's the sorcery. It does force you to like force the opponent to pay 2, which is tempo positive. But this does actually become pretty nasty if you can play it at instant speed somehow.
You minister it, that's how you get to the instant speed.
Yeah, or just something like Witch's Invocation as a more general thing. But yeah, Minister works as well. And then if you can play this on your opponent's end step, then you untap, and then just cast the card by exiling Swipe Secrets. That seems pretty nasty.
I feel like Minister has better things to do than casting your opponent's cards.
Well, you don't have to play this in Minister specifically. There's a decent amount of ways to give stuff flash, and Witch's Invocation, of course. And it's not like this card is crazy if you just are trying to go podcast it and then immediately flash it back. Takes 4 mana to cast 1 drop from your opponent's hand, which, I mean, if it's like Scorch, that's pretty good. 5 mana for 2 is also pretty reasonable. Worst case scenario, it slows down your opponent. If you really want to get spicy with it, you can like play Absolve.
Okay, we're moving on.
We have Unrelenting.
Hey, it's a reference to Unraveling.
So I think this ends up being better than Unraveling. So it does a lot more proactive things. Board wipes, though not the best board wipe, but it's decent.
Rex Creature Bomb it. Assuming the nerfs haven't wrecked it enough already.
Yeah, 2/2 isn't very good on a 2-mana card, but if you're getting multiple modes, it's pretty good. Draining for 3 is a pretty large number. And then probably the most important mode, searching your library for a card with 4 cost or greater. There's some pretty good 4 drops in this format.
Fetches Ego.
Yeah, fetches Ego. Fetches Rot. Fetches another new card in Drop Bear. And notably, Drop Bear can get back Unrelenting. So if you're getting multiple modes on it, that's a pretty nice engine.
Yeah, you can get Thin the Veil, so you can Thin the Veil for more Unrelenting. Start stacking up the effects.
So you can get a lot of Unrelentings pretty fast, and because it's so proactive, it's pretty good to get a lot of Unrelentings. Unlike Unraveling, where it's like, okay, eventually your opponent's going to play a card you counter, then you go +1. Unrelenting does kind of kill your opponent reasonably fast, or fetches something that can kill your opponent if need be. So speaking of Unrelenting, Swipe Secrets, and Unraveling, we have Mei's Collection, which has all those cards and Mind Rip.
It's Flash. And enters the battlefield, you get to draw a card from its codex.
So if you want more copies of Unraveling and Unrelenting, right, here's your extra copies. Copies 5-12.
I feel like copies beyond the 4th don't really contribute at that point.
You need to draw all 4, so this gives you a way to get all 4. I think you probably would play this in deck with Unrelenting. Probably don't play Unraveling. Play it with some counters, so your opponent plays something, you counter, play this otherwise. And I think this is just like a win condition by itself, to be honest. So, of course, Unrelenting wins the game in a reasonable fashion. Unraveling gives you hard counters. And hard counters are pretty good at winning the game if you have anything else going on. Main reason you don't see them is because they're expensive. Yeah. But late game, they're really good. Mind Rip fetches something from opponent's library. Swipe Secrets fetches something from opponent's hand. And, well, Unrelenting, as we mentioned, can grab Drop Bear. Then Drop Bear can grab Mei's Collection. And then you replay Mei's Collection.
So next up, one of my favorite cards from the set, at least one of the funniest cards from the set, Off on a Date. You get to literally just ship your creatures. Yeah, so I think kind of what sets this card apart from a lot of other Flicker spells, particularly Tenuous Existence, or like Orochi, or like Aethermat's Familiar, is that's really good at stopping attacking creatures, because you can do kind of very basic things, like play Keone. Like you have a random Keone in play. Keone is a good card, so a good blink target too. Your opponent attacks you with 2 things, block one with Keone, then target Keone, and the one you didn't block with Off on a Date. End of turn, Keone comes back down, get Off on a Date back to your hand, and do it all again next turn. It's a penguin dating simulator. You can also, of course, use it with stuff like Coronis as kind of a very solid blink target. I mean, with Coronis, you have to blink it in response to it entering, right? Yeah, but I think generally in blink strategies, you're probably playing the long game anyways. That's probably not too bad. If you want something like more consistent card advantage, you can use like Ancestral Council. Ooh, still spicy. Slow, but you can kind of do the same thing with Keone if you want, fetching more Off on Dates, or you can fetch whatever the hell removal you want to deal with what your opponent has. Restricted to Ancestral Council, of course. Not rude, just killing them after you go on a date with them. Yeah, I mean, all's fair in love and war, right? Right. Familiar is
a bit restricted in the fact that it's basically just a worst tenuous existence if your opponent doesn't have creatures on that you care to bounce. But it's probably good enough that you're not complaining too much. Moving on, we have Petrified Guard, which fits into the very important niche of 2-mana cards that exile cards from your graveyard for free.
Ooh, what important niche. Wait, is Petrified Guard really the only thing that does this in MSEM?
Yeah, there's a few other options, but they're either more expensive or like more able to be killed. Being 2 mana is particularly important because EHS hits it. But the reason why this is relevant is because there's a pretty decent number of cards that want you to be exiling cards from your graveyard or moving them from the graveyard, and you get advantage of it. So in particular, you have Mausoleum Resident and Hadik's Cohort. Mausoleum Resident being really efficient, only 1 mana, lifelink. If you can trigger it, Menace grows infinitely. Hadik's Cohort being really nasty if you have a big graveyard you can exile, where it's not too crazy to get like 5 creatures in a 10-card graveyard. Then something Hadik's Cohort is doing 10. The 2-drops, so it's not too hard to get multiple in play. You can also do stuff like Corvid Heretic, which doesn't even need creatures to be exiled and drains for 1. So there's a pretty solid list of cards. And Petrified Guard being colorless means that's been nice on the colors, so you can play it in Jund if you want. You can also play with EHS if you want, maybe just rely on Mausoleum Resident Heretic, play Abzan, or play Naya Graveyard stuff, I guess, with Hadik's Cohort.
Well, definitely didn't expect Petrified Guard to make a splash in Constructed.
It's also not the craziest card. I mean, 2 mana 3/1 manlandy thing is definitely something.
You're really going to be excelling the virtues of attacking with a limited fodder.
I mean, dodge is sorcery speed removal. It hits planeswalkers. Like, I'm not going to say it's good, but it's not like it only exiles stuff in graveyard.
Sure.
But moving on, we have the Moribund Manuscript, which gets you powerful removal.
You need your own guy to die in order to cure opponent's things.
Yeah, you do definitely need to be putting this into a deck that, like, has stuff dying naturally. So something more aristocratic. But even if you're just drawing like 2 of these cards in the right matchup, that's pretty scary. I mean, these are all instant speed removal spells, so they are going to stop most decks in what they're doing. And if you get like 2 or 3, you can definitely prolong the game to make sure that you get like all of them, probably. So there's a lot of like quote unquote free value. There are also a couple of things that like want to die in white black, of course. Swan Cohort being a common one. If you want to just play mono removal, you can jam whole instead of Excellence. We talked about Token of Tribulation as another both player sacrifice a creature kind of card, which both work pretty well with this.
And you can use it with vials too. Like you can use vials to sacrifice creatures, and you can use vials to sacrifice itself, so you can start drawing from the library.
Yeah, definitely some decks really don't like to see you drawing removal every turn, because definitely something like aggro is not going to like that. Or more tribal type of aggro builds don't like you one-for-oneing them every turn of the game. You can also do stuff like maybe look into stuff like ninjas, which plays like Shinrei, and so this becomes like really slot efficient if you can do that. So even though ninjas wants to have like a ton of 2-drop creatures, maybe you can just play this because, well, it only takes up 1 slot for 5 removal spells. It does take a bit of setup, but also notably you can choose any card from the library. Don't need to be drawing off the top when a creature dies. So if you want, you can even specifically look for Event Horizon as non-creature hate, or like Second Death as grave hate. But moving forward, we have a pretty crazy anthem in Tranquil Path.
Doesn't look like an anthem, but actually is an anthem.
Yeah, so relevantly, you don't need to mill non-land cards off Explore. So if you attack with everything is unblocked. With a non-land card, you can just keep it on top a couple times if you really want the counters. But if you mill it, want to get the lands, that is also really good.
It does let you dig pretty deep if you really want to dig with this thing, if you have a bunch of creatures.
Yeah, so maybe a natural place for this is replacing like Griffin Country in Flyers, where the kind of tutor from Griffin Country can be replaced by the fact that Explore digs quite deep. Also helps you find more lands, so often fetched Penya off Griffin Country as kind of a late game tool. And well, you need to get up to 5 lands, you're not playing that many lands, Explore helps you do that. Honestly, I wouldn't even say that this is super crazy in some kind of all-in aggro deck. Like if you want to jam 4 Silent Wanderers and Overgrowth Guardians and whatnot, maybe you can even do that.
So creature vomit, but even more vomity and less overpowered?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, you thought that like Critter's Companion into EHS was bad. How about like Critter's Companion, untap a whole bunch of Silent Wanderers, get like 6 creatures in play, turn 3, double Tranquil Path.
Yeah, we'll see when that happens.
Definitely a Christmas line, dude. And you do definitely need something that's a bit more reliable than Tranquil Path, but definitely has some high rolls outside of decks with that's playing mono evasion. So moving on, we have a kind of crazy card in Versatility. Definitely a bit of a meme card. Gets 5 different triple colored cards in the villainy cycle. Does fix for them, which is pretty important when you need 15 mana requirements. And also does make all your spells all colors. So no matter what spell you cast, you are triggering whatever one you have in play. Few exceptions, like Brutality needs creatures, Villainy needs non-creatures, but for the most part, you're pretty happy.
I feel like some of the spells are definitely better than others because Whimsy is a lot worse than Villainy, for one.
Yeah, I think basically all of them are worse than Villainy. Especially, like, we'll talk about creativity in its own time, but creativity needs a lot of, like, build around it. Brutality probably don't have too many creatures in this deck. Heraldry is really good, though. I think Heraldry and Villainy being able to kind of catch you back up in board presence are kind of going to be the 2 key cards you want on top. Unfortunately, It doesn't let you choose what you draw off the codex, unlike Moribund Manuscript.
Yeah, so like if Villainy is on the bottom, then at least you get to groan as you see that you're never going to draw Villainy.
I think it might just be better to think about this card as like a mana fixer more so than the codex, which is a bit weird. Because just needing to spend like a draw to get what's potentially not a good card is kind of rough. There are, of course, ways that you can mitigate this. Like you can pay cantrips, Monkey Shines, for example, Seek Prophecy. But really, it almost feels like you're playing this to get Villainy or Heraldry in like mono blue, so to speak, or like blue-green or something like that.
At least that sounds really funny.
Maybe not even crazy to talk about stuff like Log of Recluse into RFE, into Versatility, play like Villainy from your hand. Like maybe this is probably bad because like you're splashing for Villainy, but like maybe it's doable. Maybe you can afford to play Villainy. Maybe like play the land from Seasons of War that make all your basics tap for black.
I think you're trying too hard at that point.
Yeah, I guess even then you need to find a way to get Versatility in play because otherwise your Villainy doesn't do anything.
Yeah.
Which is a bit unfortunate, but I think as far as like meme cards go, this is probably not the craziest thing. Because these cards are really good if you can get them in play, but they are pretty expensive.
So moving on, we have Acolyte of the Tempest. So it's a double aristocrat, I guess.
Yeah, it also has that pivotal 3 mana cost. So it's a double Bloodlust that's unearthable, which is pretty tempting. Also 0/4, so it's pretty non-hard to kill.
Yeah.
It also maybe doesn't pair well, but there's another option in Grieving Process, which is basically the same card except on enchantment. Has that same kind of double Bloodlust effect. That does want your own creatures to die for the death knell.
I mean, they do let you double up in death knells, so if there's a death knell deck out there, which I'm not sure if there is, but if there is one out there, they might be interested in looking at these cards.
Yeah, I think unfortunately just that you only get 1 death knell makes it a bit awkward, because if you're playing Death Knell deck, is the Death Knell you really want to trigger a Drain one? I feel like there's stronger Death Knells out there, but I suppose Acolyte of Tempest doubles up anyways.
So next up, Barhopping and Minei. So this card lets you draw 4 cards, and that immediately raises alarm bells because a 3 mana draw 4 cards. That's pretty good.
Yeah, draw 4. I mean, I don't think there's necessarily a great like canon comparison.
I think it's better to think of it as a wheel because you're not going to have a hand afterwards.
Depending on how many cards you have in hand, you could do like draw 3 to hand size as 1, which isn't the craziest thing, provided you can like consistently cast the stuff. Immediately, this is probably more so a combo card than anything else. There are definitely ways to abuse it in non-combo decks.
Well, I mean, Bird's not running this, right? Because 3 mana's way too much, and you don't really have any mana left over to cast spells after this if you draw 4.
Yeah, there's also Mindstorm's Eye, which is probably better than Burn, even if you have to splash for it specifically. But I think just using it, kind of playing this and knowing that you have enough ways to get rid of it, whether that's with like Vile tokens or like Kaelin.
Right, use Kaelin to keep drawing 4 cards. Like, playing decks don't already have enough value.
And if you really want to get spicy with it, you can maybe increase your hand size to a point that -8 doesn't matter too much. So you play Archmage's Tower, you have no maximum hand size. Hey, Ricky, what's Infinity -8?
Infinity?
I don't think I have more than infinity cards in hand, even after drawing 4.
Yeah. But then you're playing Reliquary Tower in your deck. And you know how many people put Reliquary Tower in their command deck even though they really shouldn't.
But when you have like 11 cards in hand, it feels so bad to discard them. Like, I prefer just keep my cards in hand.
I know.
And I mean, with Barhopping and Minei being so cheap on the mana requirements, only having a single red pip, you can probably afford to play some Archmage's Towers if you want. Like, it is definitely a cost, and you do need to find it. But, I mean, you just drew 4 cards. There's probably some other ways to balance Barhopping and Minei. Maybe play like Crest, or, again, Vials, depending on the color you're in. There's also kind of the funky thing is using it as a 3-mana breakthrough. Draw 4, discard your hand, and you're happy with that. I don't know if any deck wants that, but...
Next up, another 3-mana enchantment that doesn't really do much to affect the board. Brainstorming Session. So instead of just making draw cards, this thing lets you get better card selection.
Yeah, so having every one of your draw steps be look at the top 3 is really insane, to be completely honest. Like, 3 cards is kind of the point where you kind of never have a bad draw. And relevantly, this is on every draw. So if you're playing cantrips alongside this, then it becomes even better filtering. I think the sack ability is probably not going to be too relevant, besides maybe in the late game. Though honestly, maybe there's a chance that if you're playing this, you deck out.
Actually, yeah, good point.
Reasonably fast. Maybe just use blue to sacrifice it.
I mean, 3 mana to just basically tutor a card after you've been exiling enough cards doesn't sound too bad.
Like, there isn't a empty deck win condition that's, like, especially great. This is something that would have worked incredibly well with, like, Last Passage.
Yeah.
Where you go, like, turn 2 Last Passage, turn 3 this, and then sack all your forebode tokens.
Boy, I wonder why Last Passage is banned.
Well, not because of this card, let's just say that.
Yeah.
But this does actually get you through your deck incredibly quickly. Unfortunately, it does have pretty stiff competition because pre-drop slow value enchantment in blue is a very contested slot. I mean, you looked at Spiritual Guidance in Valinov. There's also stuff like Kaelin or Enlightenment, which are also incredibly powerful tools. So definitely by playing this, you're making a pretty bold statement that those 3 cards, or I'm sure there's some others, are not good enough. This does let you play more one-ofs, though, which might be interesting, since it does do such a good job at churning through your deck.
So next up, another 3-mana enchantment, and the final card of the villainy cycle, Creativity.
So I don't think anyone super knows what Creativity is like supposed to be doing, because I think really what you need to do to activate Creativity, cast a spell with an alternate casting cost, is much harder than any of the other parts of the cycle. Even if you do have a couple kind of freebies with stuff like Rail Lines or Emissary of Antiquity.
And Orchestrate. It works really well with the new Orchestrate because the new Orchestrate will resolve after this thing has already hit the field.
Yeah, so it could have like Storm Surge or Orchestrate Storm Surge turn to Orchestrate Audi's Invocation.
The new Audi's Invocation?
Then 3 Creativity, Orchestrate spells come with a stack. You get 4 tokens from Creativity. You get a token from Audi's Invocation. They all get haste and +1/+1 from Audi's Invocation. Then Storm Surge hits the blocker, I suppose, hit for 10.
Yeah.
And you also have Creativity in play. So the second mode is what you more so be looking at if you're trying to build it more so like Villainy and less about this alternate condition, since getting free spellcasts is really good.
Yeah.
And even if you don't hit anything off the top, then looting it is also very good, particularly when you get it on every spellcast. So, I mean, we just looked at Brainstorming Session, and I mean, Brainstorming Session is kind of like looting 2 on every draw step, kind of, where it just gives you an incredible amount of filtering. Creativity kind of does that too. And of course, if you cast something for free off the top, you get 2 tokens, something you don't even need to build around the alternate condition. There are also some cards from the set that work well with it. Sweet Nothings probably being the best example of that, where you can free cast it if you tap 2 creatures with different names. So not only do you get the alternate condition Creativity, which gets you 2 tokens, which maybe helps you cast future Sweet Nothings, but you also get a 3-drop cast from your hand, so you have a decent chance to like free cast something off the top. And even if you can't cast Sweet Nothings and it's bad, then loot away with Creativity.
Right.
Lots of synergy there. Additionally, if you want to just build around Sweet Nothings, you can play stuff like Minister of Zealots, which works exceptionally well. Gets 2 creature names for Sweet Nothings. Lets you like cast on turn 2, keep the Cleric in play, or just stuff like Raga that makes multiple card names. The tokens ETB tapped, which isn't the best. For Sweet Nothings, you can't cast immediately, but still pretty good regardless.
Yeah. The next up, a Platypus, which is, I think, a new creature type that got introduced with this set. There's currently 2 Platypuses in MSEM, and they're both from this set.
We looked at Hey the Platypus or Inconspicuous Platypus earlier. I think both are pretty interesting. Curious Amalgam's mostly interesting because it makes so many blockers.
And even blocks well itself, being a 1 for Death Toucher.
Yeah, so just like, instead of matchups, just playing eggs in a row on turn 3 is going to stymie a lot of aggression. Doesn't cost you too much chump block with them, so it gains you a lot of life.
Yeah, and when its eggs die, you can get some extra value from it. I mean, there's some pretty good adventures in this format, like Valdez. You want to recast Valdez? There you go. I mean, Downhill Forge Master, completely wrong colors, but hey.
And not only that, but Token of Tribulation works really well with this card, since not only is it adventure, but it's an adventure that causes one of your eggs to die.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the card is really expensive. 6 mana to get both the eggs and it in play. It does help you survive, but maybe not the easiest thing to get going.
Well, I mean, what other cards make eggs?
Well, you could play it with Polyp Pools.
Oh,
then
yeah.
You play From the Trees, Drop Bear's Adventure to turn Polyp Pools into a 1/1 Death Touch, then trade.
And then get Drop Bears back. I mean, that sounds really good, right?
I mean, it's certainly something.
But you're not intimidated by a bear repeatedly dropping down for the trees? You just burn up all your lands to, trade 1 for 1 with your opponent's creatures.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely is an incredibly good late game win condition, but at the same time, there are a lot of pretty good late game win conditions. Could just be playing more drop bears. So you play a drop bear, get something back, trade drop bear with what your opponent has, then you play drop bear to get back your drop bear.
Drop bear.
Yeah, drop your drop bear on your drop bear. But if you can make use of 3 0/2s, this definitely has some potential. And decks have definitely made use of 0/2s in the past. Cough, cough, creature element, cough, cough. But moving on, we have maybe something that's a bit more reasonably speeded for a kind of value late game creature piece in Hana, Aethertechnician.
So Hana lets you cycle your artifacts because it's X+1 or less, so you can keep cycling 1-cost artifacts. I mean, from Bark's decks how there's a lot of good 1-cost artifacts like cantrips.
Yeah, so you can play your Sealed Riftways and your Terraformers Globes, which you're already probably playing to play Barks, and then Hana lets you filter those, as well as starts to make treasures. Making first contact becomes easier, provided that you don't have one of the 2 artifacts in graveyard, since cycling them will always trigger first contact. Also, important lets you trigger first contact on your opponent's turn, so you can even get 2 treasures in turn cycle.
Yeah. Also, you know what other card cares about casting? Box you.
Yeah, so if you play Hana Aethertechnician, box you along, suddenly becomes really easy to get spellcasts going, and then you get all your treasures going, and you have all your mana going, and you have Box going, so you have all this value, and Hana also is getting value, and Boxy Malong is getting value, and then you've cast 20 Unceasing Flames at this point.
Yeah.
Does need to untap, which is a bit of a annoyance, but honestly it might be more reliable than untapping than Box You is, weirdly, just because if you are playing a deck with 0 creatures and Hana is your only creature, the opponent doesn't really want to be playing creature removal.
Right. I mean, if you're playing a deck with 0 creatures, then Box You is basically just as vulnerable.
Yeah, exactly. Moving forward, we have Inconspicuous Otter, which cheats out 5-drop or less auras.
But it needs something to die.
Yeah, fortunately that condition is generally not too hard to meet, but it is definitely non-trivial if you want to trigger yourself. I'm going to assume that this card does something just because it's a 3-drop that gets back 5 drops. The auras, that's still pretty crazy. Additionally, you can do it as many times per turn as possible. So there's kind of a pretty basic infinite with this card where you just have Sack Outlet, Inconspicuous Otter, as well as a couple of random do-nothing creatures. Then you can play Fist of Ironwood, which is actually funny that Fist of Ironwood is in this one. Because I remember playing with Fist of Ironwood as a kid in Canon Magic. But Fist of Ironwood goes on to random creature that you're willing to sack, or maybe just cast it from hand onto random creature. You sack that creature to Sack Outlet, goes to your graveyard, you get Death Knell, and then it comes back, chant a sapling, and then you sack that sapling to Sack Outlet, and then it comes back, and then yada, yada, yada.
Yeah, it feels like a lot of effort to get infinite creatures and infinite sacks.
I mean, is Fist of Ironwood really that bad of a card?
Yes.
Put on your Acolyte champion, give it trample, +2/+2. And that's basically a Gala buff.
I guess.
This is the new and improved Gillo, Fist of Ironwood.
You heard it here first.
I mean, it wouldn't be the first time a common from Seasons of War did something degenerate.
Yeah. Maybe they'll actually have to nerf it.
Yeah, no Fist of Ironwood. No one would see that one coming.
Yeah.
And of course, you can do kind of more fair things with it, I guess, if you really want to. Get back whatever curse or what have you. Though if it's going to be too expensive, then you do need to get an engrave on it somehow, which makes some more complex stuff. But as far as cards go, having a random infinite on something that isn't unreasonable as a kind of value engine is pretty good. That's where most of the good infinites come from, even.
So next up, Karina, Planar Tourist. So a very interesting card. You can activate Karina's ability during your opponent's turn if you manage to make first contact during your opponent's turn. I mean, this card upticks really quickly because if you can trigger first contact every turn, you're basically plussing 3 times every turn cycle.
Yeah, so you can go Karina, and then plus on your turn, and then first contact on your turn, and then first contact on your opponent's turn, and then plus on your turn, and then first contact on your turn, and you've ultimated.
I mean, like, how easy is it for you to actually do that?
Probably not too easy. I mean, you can definitely do something arbitrary, like play 4 Karina and 1 of every other card, which makes making first contact pretty darn easy. There's definitely some mana requirement where, like, you probably need to be doing something with, like, rail lines if you want to do that, like, at any reasonable speed. So something like turn 4, Karina, rail line, or the, like, single for 1, maybe. The mill, you're probably better off just trying to play Karina plus twice, 5 loyalty, hope your opponent doesn't have an answer.
And I mean, Karina does make both players draw cards, so if you have some way to benefit from your opponent's drawing, like less skill Serpent or Star Scribe Oracle, then you're pretty happy.
I think, unfortunately, the fact that it draws once every turn, or I guess twice in your turn, doesn't quite work as well as you'd hope with a lot of the draw restrictions, just because a lot of them are like, your opponent can't draw more than once every turn, so they still get the draw on your turn. You can't completely shut them out and make Karina +1 into just a you draw card, but it might be worth considering anyways, because Karina is in good colors for that kind of stuff. If you want to play like Trade Route Bandit.
I mean, the -2, you can activate it at instant speed if you first contact.
Yeah, I think the -2, if it was on a Planeswalker that didn't get free abilities, it'd be pretty bad. Just because it is kind of a basic blink/flicker. But when you're getting so many additional activations, it's probably pretty good.
Yeah, and
it does
then,
kind of protect herself if you can activate Curse Contact on your opponent's turn too.
Yeah, and I mean, the -7, it's an Omniscience, I guess. I mean, is it worth gunning for the -7?
Probably not, but at the same time, if you are playing Karina, there's probably a decent chance that you get there in some games anyways. So having it as a decent plan is probably not the worst idea, but I don't think it's something that you want to like specifically aim for, particularly because you're giving your opponent so many cards that they can just point a random burn spell at Karina, and well, they just drew 3 additional cards from Karina, so they're not going to be too happy about the card disadvantage.
I mean, you just drew that many cards too.
Yeah, unfortunately, you do need to stop your opponent from killing Karina, which is a bit harder than killing Karina. Generally speaking, threats are cheaper than answers, of course.
Yeah. So moving on, Prove Your Worth. What a strange card. Is this thing good?
Well, what Prove Your Worth does is assures Logger's Recluse placed on top. Turn 1 Logger Recluse, turn 2 Prove Your Worth, explore 3 times, attack for 3.
Yeah.
Next turn Prove Your Worth, explore 6 times, attack for 9. Next turn Prove Your Worth again. And then Logger Recluse attacks for 21 damage. Whoa.
Exploring 3 does let you see 3 cards if you really want to.
Not only that, but it also mills 3 cards, which is potentially interesting. It also finds you lands, which, again, Logger Recluse likes a lot. Offworld Surveyors also likes a lot.
Oh.
I know that's your favorite card in the format.
Offworld Surveyor taps to put the land into place. You can't, like, turn 2 attack with it.
Yeah, you do miss some damage, but same time, you are getting a whole bunch of lands. So just being able to get the trigger, even if you don't care about counters, getting like a couple lands is probably worthwhile playing Offworld Surveyors over maybe more vanilla options. And once you've like gotten past turn 2, Prove Your Worth, then you can play whatever 3, 4, 5 drop you have that you actually want to put counters on. Not sure exactly what that is. Rug is not necessarily the best colors for like stacking something up with like something big with like lifelink, for example. But it stacks up counters kind of fast enough that it doesn't seem like you need to be especially picky. I mean, you could just be going like, oh yeah, I'll play Cane Dancer, and I'll kill them with Cane Dancer.
Huh. I mean, Bounty of the Gardens is also in these colors.
Yeah. It is a bit unfortunate that I don't think there's any great tramplers that you want to be playing in this style of deck, because trample is what you probably want when you're putting so many plus one counters on something, and you can only attack with one thing.
Yeah.
But maybe you could get away with like Lumbering Hillock if you need trample. I think this card's probably more general than it looks. Log Recluse, of course, shows up in a lot of different decks, since it is pretty powerful in the late game. 3/3 is pretty sizable. Actually, a good target is Panya for a couple reasons.
Right.
Flying, so you have evasion, gets you lands for the tail, and then it also gets you additional trigger on the extra turn.
Yeah, and you can flash it in so it doesn't die to sorcery speed removal.
So maybe you have something like Temur Tempo-ish. I mean,
You tap you out for a 3-man champ on your turn.
well, okay, hear me out. You go like end of turn to Madia, untap, prove your worth, attack for 6.
Okay.
I mean, how is your opponent killing a 5/5 Madia?
A good question. They have to actually hard remove it.
And then you untap and your opponent's like, and then you have your Temur Tempo stuff. You skip your turn 3, which is an annoying turn for Temur Tempo, because you're on King Dancer stuff. Play your Portal Fractions and your Bounties now, or you play your Panya to set up for a tail next turn.
And meanwhile, you're milling a ton of cards for Cane Dancer.
Yeah, like if you find a Portal Fracture, you can just mill it, and then your Cane Dancer hand is happy. Or you find a Cane Dancer and you just put it on top.
Yeah.
And of course, Temur Tempo also doesn't really like drawing additional lands, and this definitely helps you not draw lands.
Yeah.
So mainly, as you mentioned, there's the problem of you're playing a 3-mana sorcery speed spell in Temur Tempo, which is maybe against the tagline of the deck, but it's something there for you. So next card is Sen, the Haunting Gaze, which kind of has two parts to it. First, as kind of like a Ellen and Meva type card, big creature that you can stock counters on up to, can get lifelink, gets evasion, and generally just dominates the board. The other part is as a Profane MSA target.
Well, I mean, Ellen and Meva comes with the keywords, and you pay to put counters on it. This guy, you actually have to work to get keywords onto this thing, and then you can start putting counters on it. So it's a lot slower than Ellen and Meva.
It is slower at the start, at least. But if you actually want to put stuff on this, it's way cheaper than Alan Meva, I think, generally. Does need a more specific deck than Alan Meva, 4 mana being easier to get if you're not building towards it than Death Triggers. But you also don't need to like pay mana for it. 4 mana is a lot.
So, like, how are you getting other guys to die?
I'm sure that there's a couple ways you can do that. I mean, we talked about a couple of them when we went over the Moribund Manuscript. A Swan Cohort is pretty happy messing around Sen because, well, Swan Cohort likes to die and likes to fetch legendary creatures. You can play like Token of Tribulation. Again, another card works well. Swan Cohort, sacks Swan Cohort, gets fetch shock Swan Cohort, makes your own creatures die. Also buffs up Sen, so easier to get a big lifelinker. Don't need to give much preference to +1/+1 counters. Alternatively, there's kind of more traditional methods such as like Channel of the Veil as just a sack outlet. Maybe play with Dawson as another sack outlet.
That's a Profanatory target. Is there any other better options at 3? I don't think there is, right? So this is basically the cheapest Profanatory target.
Yeah, normally 3 instead of like 4 as like a mid-range thing is interesting because it curves out of Profane MSA. So turn 2 Profane MSA, turn 3 fetch Sen instead of fetch Polyp Pools. Play Sen, Profane MSA is active.
You don't have to waste your draw step on land. And then I guess next turn you fetch the Gen, and now you have a 4-drop, and then next turn you fetch Cause Abomination, and you have a 5-drop. So like you have your entire curve contained in one card.
Yeah, I mean, you did take 14 damage to do that, but
hey, these guys have lifelink. You can earn it back.
Yeah, decent chance that you're even greater than 20. The curve of Profane MSA into Sen into Jejune is kind of funny because to play Jejune on 4, you need to blood price it.
Yeah, so like you sack Profane Emissary. Wait, no, that doesn't work. Never mind.
Well, you sack Profane Emissary and then you get a counter on Sen.
Yeah, and then how are you going to fetch Cause Abomination on 5?
You just draw it naturally, I guess.
Okay, sure.
The curve of Profane Emissary into Sen is also kind of interesting because both of these cards are really scary. So if your opponent's trying to deal with your board, well, if they kill Profane Emissary, then Sen gets a counter.
Right.
It doesn't quite get as scary as Profane Emissary as a 4/4 lifelink with a 1 counter, but it gets there pretty fast. Give it flying or lifelink, depending on the matchup, maybe +1/+1. And it does get out of hand pretty quickly, whereas if Sen dies, then well, you still have Profane Emissary. Yeah. Unfortunately, you would need to fetch Polyp Pools, but
I mean, you could just fetch another Sen, right?
Yeah, I guess you can. Like, just always fetch Sen instead of Polyp Pools if you really want. Also gives you a way to get around like a Mio Gate on Polyp Pools or Imperial Siege.
Yeah. Does triggering the death nail of another permanent ever matter?
Probably not. There's some decent death knells. It's something like Acolyte Tempest, of course, triggers on the same thing. Kind of lets you double up on Acolyte Tempest's static ability, which lets you trigger another death knell. So you kind of get 2 death knells from that one trigger. There's also the like off case of playing Sen with Kinkan. Since if you name Sen with Kinkan, you get a line of legend rule. So if you get a sack, you get infinite death knell triggers. You do need to sacrifice one of them at some point. Otherwise, it's a draw, since you can't not activate Death Knell.
Huh.
But Kinkan's a pretty reasonable card by itself. Cantrips, if you have anything in play, it's pretty good. Works with Channel of the Veil pretty well for a couple reasons. So like a curve of Channel of the Veil into Sen into Kinkan isn't the craziest thing. But moving on, we have Tinker Tantrum, which is a bit of a finicky card, particularly because it doesn't tutor up the curve consistently. It just reveals cards from top.
Yeah, and it's mana value X+1 or less than, so it doesn't always go up the curve.
Yeah, so if you're trying to sack like Sealed Riftways or something, you can't be like, oh yeah, I'll sack my Sealed Riftway to get my Weeping Lotus. No, your Sealed Riftway can get a Sealed Riftway.
Or a Weeping Lotus.
Yeah, or a Weeping Lotus.
So notably, this thing lets you cycle your artifacts. So if you're playing a bunch of artifacts with the ETBs, like you already do in Bark's decks, then this might be a good option.
Arguably, it does exactly what Box does, which is kind of funny, because basically every turn Box draws a card, basically every turn this draws a card. It does cost 3, isn't a Planeswalker, which is a plus or minus, because Box does get a draw when it dies, since the artifact re-enters.
Also, you can play 2-cost artifacts with this thing pretty well, because it's either going to flip to a 1-cost, which lets you flip to a 2-cost, or the 2-cost is going to flip into either a 2-cost or a 1-cost. So maybe if there's any 2-cost ETB artifacts you can't usually play in Barks, maybe you can play it here.
Yeah, like I mentioned, Weeping Lotus, which might be interesting with this, just kind of lets you get around the fact that it's such an expensive draw engine. If you want to be really sneaky with it, you can actually do kind of the more typical polymorph style stuff and just not play anything, but it's not a good hit. So maybe you don't play Box, you play like 4 Sealed Riftway as your only artifact one, but then you play a bunch of token makers. So you play your Prying Inquiries and your Val Edicts and your Dawsons, all these things that make tokens. So that way you can get a Sealed Riftway on the ATB, and then on the upkeep, the Sealed Riftway probably turns into a 2-drop. And then your 2-drop probably turns into a 3-drop. And your 3-drop is Valinov Collector.
That actually does work, because maybe just play a few 2-drops.
Yeah, I mean, you can even just play one of each if you feel like living dangerously. But speaking of Valinov Collector, we should probably actually talk about that card.
Yeah.
Because this card is really scary. So, Mardu colors, much like Tinker Tantrum, so it works there. Much like Dawson, works there. Whenever it or another artifact enters, you ding your opponent for 2 and gain 2. So there's a bit of tension in this card in that to make most use of the damage, you want to play it in an aggressive deck, but to get the most damage out of this card, you want to play it in a slower deck.
Well, the good news is self-replication works pretty well with both types of decks.
Yeah, additionally, you also have Dawson, which both makes tokens pretty cheaply, also hits face, so you get the reach, make good use of damage.
And like rail lines, you can play them for free, and they turn on self-replication early, so I mean, you're playing them in this deck anyways.
Yeah, there's also stuff like Devised Companions, which makes 3 artifacts. But there's a lot of ways to stack this up. We also mentioned like Weeping Lotus with Tinker Tantrum, which is another pretty scary card with this, both because it lets you go like turn 2 Weeping Lotus, turn 3 Valinov Collector self-replication, get Valinov's trigger, and then you get a Weeping Lotus on instep, or Lotus Petal, I suppose, which gets you another trigger, which is 4 triggers in a pretty short time span, so that's deal 8, gain 8. And then if you have another self-replication, well, you can also sack the Lotus Petal for another 4 damage and 4 life.
Because the problem is that means you've kept those cards until you play this thing down on turn 3.
It is admittedly only 4 cards, Weeping Lotus, Valinov Collector, 2 self-replications, so it's not like it will never happen. And you can also kind of supplant those with like rail lines, because you can sack like the Lotus Petal from Weeping Lotus instead of playing land drop to play Valinov Collector. Then you play your rail line, get Valinov Collector trigger, pull land back, play land, use a land, you play the self-replication. So there's a fair amount of like give and take with this. It also becomes much easier later in the game if you have like a Dawson in play to get this going, since Dawson gives you mana, much like Weeping Lotus with the treasures. And if you have a Dawson in play, then you can plus, make a treasure, get another trigger. Valinov Collector also works really well with a couple black 1-drops and like pay up, good 3-drop to pay up into, make sure that it discards what you want instead of giving you a treasure. Into Valinov Collector is really scary. Also is another bill, which getting Valinov Collector out for 1 mana is also really scary.
Yeah, just scary card in general. Moving on, Blizzard Dragon. It's a 4-drop that doesn't do anything immediately. Or does
Or
it?
does it?
Yeah.
Maybe scary in a different way than Valinov Collector. Maybe scary more so in the way of like Infectious Ego. Blizzard Dragon's pretty interesting because you actually need to work for it, unlike Infectious Ego.
Is that slight against Infectious Ego?
Maybe a little bit. That doesn't mean that Blizzard Dragon has no like upsides. Like flying is, I think, a decent amount of matchups better than Lifelink on Infectious Ego. Infectious Ego does get blocked and killed a decent amount in these kind of bigger matchups. Additionally, the attack trigger is a fair bit better than Infectious Ego's trigger, since it locks down a creature, so they can't swing back. The melee Infectious Ego does have lifelink, so is that. Blizzard Dragon also doesn't have the permanent restriction that Infectious Ego has. So if you want to do something funky like get into play quickly, give it haste somehow, then Blizzard Dragon is really good at doing that, actually.
Yeah.
So maybe if there's a hypothetical deck that got a couple of them in play on turn 4, turn 3, and gave them haste, hypothetically, maybe you'd consider this card.
Yeah, hypothetically.
Hypothetically. Not in black, which is hypothetically important for this deck.
Yeah.
Don't a ton of ways to give haste in the format, but there is stuff like Oddie's Invocation. So if you want, you can go like turn 1 Dork, turn 2 Orchestrate Oddie's Invocation, turn 3 Blizzard Dragon, give it haste, which is a pretty nasty turn 3, force your opponent to sack a permanent. They're landed on a tap, so even if they have opponent to sack that's not a land, they're still constrained in mana. And then you attack next turn, and they're still going to be constrained on mana.
Yeah. Or, you can give this thing haste by somehow getting Speak of Darius into play with this thing. Or even 2 of these things.
Yeah, it does become a bit harder with a couple changes to 8-sack, hence the Songwriter. But this is a pretty darn good option if you can get in play with haste. Moving on, we have Dreams Come True, which is not the most efficient card, but kind of reads like a command almost.
Try 1, draw 2, gain 3, exile 4. I mean, the design is very elegant to look at, but is it actually good?
I think this card's probably good enough. It kind of does so in a bit of a weird way, where 4 mana Scry 1, draw 2 is not necessarily good, but I think there's enough matchups that having an incidental gain 3 life, as well as exiling 4 cards from graveyards, is really good. I think there's a lot of matchups where that graveyard interaction comes in really handy, but you don't necessarily want to devote a full card to it. So having it on something that also instantly gains 3 life, which is also really important in some matchups, is pretty nice. But I think that's not much else to say about the card, just that good incidental life gain graveyard 8 on a acceptable draw spell. Moving on, we have Halcyon Days and Bright Future, which I feel like are basically the same card, weirdly enough.
I mean, one costs 4 and the other one costs 7. That's a pretty big difference.
Yeah, but I think in general, they're both kind of the cards that you play in your Jeskai control decks, and you play them and they win the game if you fulfill a basic condition. So if you untap with Halcyon Days, you probably win. If you cast Bright Future, you probably win. So it's just kind of figuring out which condition is easier to meet in whatever deck you're playing, whether that's getting 7 mana, maybe you're playing like Confirm Hypothesis and some other ramp pieces instantly, so you can play Bright Future more consistently on early turns, or whether you can manage to clear the board enough to play like Halcyon Days. But moving on, we have Leafcrown Fox, which is a Renegade Rallier, except 4 mana. That gets back a 3-drop creature, and Renegade Rallier is a pod target. This is probably also a pod target. Most natural thing to do with Leafcrown Fox, you go something like Pensive Songwriter turn 3, turn 2, whatever. Exile what looks beyond, get a Leafcrown Fox, get back Pensive Songwriter, cast whatever the hell else you have in hand. Preferably that's another What Looks Beyond or a Back in the Pack, so you can go even farther beyond. But even if you don't have those and you just have something more basic, like a Solar Flare, depending on the deck, maybe a Draw Tool, you do get 2 cracks of that with Songwriter. And then you also have a 4-drop in play that is just itching to be What Looks Beyond that you have in exile.
Yeah, and also it's Flash, which I don't think really matters that much. You can use it to rescue something if you really want to.
I think it matters more than you might think, because for the same reason that Sangjin is occasionally incredibly important in What Looks Beyond decks, in that you can get around like decks that have a ton of sorcery speed removal, like sweepers or whatnot, or counter spells too. You can go end of turn Leafcrown Fox, even if you don't get anything back, and then just pot it away.
Feels so low value though.
It's low value until you put your Summit Guardian in play and your opponent's crying. Moving forward, we have Slippery Booniep, I think this has pretty straightforward utility as a side grade to Still the Pandemonium. Doesn't hit everything that Still the Pandemonium does, artifacts and planeswalkers being the most relevant of which. But for decks that can't actually play Still the Pandemonium, like the double blue is too harsh, might be a worthwhile option over something like a Negate or Forbidden Treasure.
And I mean, the body is pretty hard to deal with. It's a 3/2 unblockable guy, potentially, with Ward 2. Like, nothing to be clocking their opponent.
Yeah, arguably this is a better clock than like Valdez is, which is kind of funny. And Valdez is pretty respectable clock in the late game. And this kind of plays similar to Valdez, which is kind of cool.
Well, at least Valdez does block this thing. Oh, it also gets blocked by Downhill Forge Master. That's the other common played adventure creature.
It also does have some random utility as a impromptu escapade target, since the only other counterspell you can get with impromptu escapade that's like reasonable is Paddle Scatter, and that's both 5 mana in total. But maybe more importantly, it costs triple blue to go escapade into Paddle Scatter, whereas this is only double blue, which is way easier.
Yeah.
I definitely run into some situations where I'm like intending to go impromptu escapade Paddle Scatter, and then realize that, hey, I don't have triple blue because my deck's base green.
So next up, the Endless Tempest, legendary enchantment with Death Knell.
So Death Knell, creatures get -1/-1, is a pretty good tool for sweeping the board. Obviously, you do need to build around a little bit because your own creatures need to die to trigger Death Knell. But if you can do so, then you can repeatedly sweep the board.
Yeah, and I mean, this thing even gives you a way to sack your own creatures.
And you can also do the sack ability infinitely. It doesn't exile the card or anything, doesn't make a copy of it. It also gets back non-creatures, which I was kind of surprised at. Feels like it should get back on creatures. But that opens up a whole new bunch of possibilities, not only with like getting more basic stuff like removal or whatnot, or like counter spells. Maybe you can activate at instant speed. But you can also, it's not too hard to go infinite with this. If you have a Wavebreaker as well as Unearth in Graveyard, that makes infinite black, or just infinite mana even.
Although it has to be spent on non-spells.
Yeah, that's a million of it. Conditional.
But maybe you just use your last Unearth on like, another guy that has an activate ability, and then you just kill your opponent with infinite mana.
Another way you can kill with this is by just activating Endless Tempest infinite times. So if you have a 3-drop that does anything on ETB, you can chain it. You can get back 3-drop, sacrifice the 3-drop to get Wavebreaker, then Wavebreaker gets back Unearth, then Unearth gets back 3-drop. I mean, it's definitely a bit of work, but it's just a kind of a pretty basic combo. I'm pretty sure that there's better ones. Another thing you can do is with Pronouncer Preserves, you can kind of do something similar. You don't make mana, but you get infinite Death Knell triggers to clear the board, and you can do that infinitely. And it's also pretty resilient to removal as well, since in response to the Pronouncer trying to be killed to stop the loop, you can just sacrifice it and get back enough, which is funny. So if you want infinite board wipes, that's something you can do. It's also probably not unreasonable just as value tool when some random control deck that plays some creatures, kind of like in the style of Minister Madness.
In fact, this is basically the reverse of Minister.
Kind of like a pod down instead of pod up, yeah. Cost 1 less even.
It's from Graveyard instead of Library.
So I think this card's pretty powerful. It is 4 mana, which is a lot, but it is also a board wipe if you can set it up, which is worth 4 mana. Moving on, we have a more basic card, but also a pretty respectable one in Urbeck Crocodile Hunter. So I think the first thing that you notice about this card is that the bench is just kind of decent. Kind of like a 3-mana Pithwelt, which isn't too bad.
Especially Speed Pithwelt.
I mean, that's still not too bad. And you have a whole Planeswalker attached to it.
So the +1 makes a guy, but it's tapped, so it doesn't project it immediately. But still, you're making 3/3 on plus. Like, you can't be too unhappy with that.
Also pluses to 5 loyalty, which is, again, pretty respectable. Not perfect, but probably good enough. -1 is removal, though you do have to pay mana for it, which is a bit unfortunate. I think really where this card shines is with fixing the curve for decks that want 5-drops. Because there's really a couple of those in the format, with Green Elemental Circle, Thriving Bubbling, and Ranger's Expertise all wanting you to play a bunch of 5-drops. So what Urbeck helps you do is actually give you a play on turn 3 or turn 2 off a dork. Also gives you removal that's efficient, which is also really nice.
Triggers Thriving Bubbling.
Triggers Green Elemental Circle, both of which are pretty important because you're playing the cards. But really just fix your curve when you're wanting to play like 12 plus 5-drops, as well as like 8 plus 1-drops to ramp up to the 5-drops. Really gives you a lot more freedom in deck building because you don't need to be worried too much about having no interaction at all. You always can rely on Urbeck to bail you out of like a random profane MSA that's beating you down or some combo piece that you need to kill. And of course, if you're playing Dorks, it comes down to 2, so you can kind of get around the fact that it's 3 mana. So sometimes it's fast enough to even kill Dorks, which is nice. But I think overall, a pretty good role player, if not exceptional in most respects. Moving on to the last card, we have Mei Liva, the Broken, which I think the most important card of the pot. This card is a -3 in combination with a static ability. So if you play a situation, opponent has, say, 3 cards in hand, 4 cards in hand. Let's say 4 because it sounds better. You play them Mei Liva, you -3, targeting opponent, they discard 3 cards, then the static ability triggers 3 times, and you get 3 loyalty counters, and also 3 cards. So you just went +6.
I mean, how are they ever coming back from that?
The -1 and the 0 are also pretty good, though probably not what you want to be doing on the turn it comes down.
You just start zeroing your opponent's permanent and start blowing up their lands.
Definitely not bad, but for 6 drop, I think the real eye-popping effect is on the -3.
Seems bad against anything that's not a control deck or a slow deck.
Yeah, that's definitely a big problem. The -1 does gain life, which does give some level of like consistency to it. Instant life gain, as always, is important. If you have a deck that just like naturally has a lot of cards in hand, whatever means, it also clocks your opponent pretty fast, which is nice for a win condition. But yeah, maybe more of a sideboard card against control-y style decks than a main deck one. Speaking of, both it and Urbeck are actually pretty good at epping counter targets, which is kind of interesting. I don't think either of them have a niche that already existing card does better, which is pretty good. So at the very least, I think you can expect these 2 cards to show up in sideboards.
And that's all the cards. So Karina's Explorations, it's a very colorful set, very jam-packed full of lots of different mechanics, a lot of interesting designs. I mean, we've seen Aura that enchants 2 things, and then the codexes, like that's just really out there.
There's definitely a lot of cards that stand out in like wanting to be abused almost. Well, a lot of cards are just kind of like very pushed versions of pretty niche effects. But I think there are the tools in the format to kind of make use of those more niche effects. Definitely, I think Codex being kind of the pinnacle of that almost, where there's kind of how you're dealing with Codex really varies quite a bit on the Codex and how your deck works, whether you're drawing naturally from the Codex or you're trying to use the Codex's condition or you're using procedural genesis, get everything out of the Codex.
Yeah, and the story and lore of the set is all over the place because this thing takes place on like 10 different planes, and each of those planes has their own storyline.
I will admit I have no idea what's happening in this set.
Well,
All I know is that there's plush tea parties, which makes this set story the best.
Yeah.
Because those sharks are really cute.
I mean, I guess this set probably ends with everyone having plush tea party. I mean, haven't you read the name of the set? It's Karina's Explorations, so it's a set about Karina exploring stuff.
Or more plushies.
Yeah, just going around the plains collecting plushies.
I mean, that's what it says on the flavor text of Plush Tea Party, and that's the only flavor text I've read in this set. So, I mean, it's probably what the set is all about. With every plane she visited, I mean, that sounds like exploration, and then she is Karina.
Yeah.
I've solved the mystery of the set. No one needs to look any farther into what's happening. I mean, it even has a watermark, and if I know anything from watermarks, that means that there's choice spotlight cards. No, I have not noticed any other cards with watermarks in the set. All the other characters don't appear at the tea party. So Urbeck, who the hell knows who he is? He's probably just some random cameo character. He's not at the tea party. Definitely a very interesting set. Mechanically, lore is great from my perspective. Maybe from other people's perspective, other things are going on. But I think tea parties are great. Any cards you're particularly excited about from the set, Ricky?
Well, unfortunately, there's no cards in the set that easily go into 8-sack, except Leafcrown Fox, but apparently I'm not actually playing that card in the current version I'm running, so unfortunately, this set is completely useless to me.
Cajun, you had a full set to put a card into a Dreamsight deck and you couldn't do it. How sad.
All I needed was the 4-drop that was better than Infectious Ego when you get 2 of them, plus a Haste Neighbor on turn 3.
Wait, but that exists in the set with Blizzard Dragon.
Oh. Maybe I should put that in my deck.
Isn't even off color.
Yeah. Okay, my favorite card now is Blizzard Dragon, assuming I play in my deck and it actually works and I don't cut it later. But what about you, Ben?
I think Maze Collection's probably the card I want to build around the most. Admittedly, it's not a very fun card. You see, I like to make decks that I don't actually like to play. Hence why Ricky is now the one playing 8-sack, or me passing on Infuse to other people. But I think Maze Collection is very unique mechanically in how it kind of changes how control decks can function. Being able to put additional hard counters in your deck is really unique in a format that doesn't really let you play hard counters very easily. Unconditional hard counters, too.
Yeah.
And not only that, you also get more tutors. And not only that, it gives you something to bounce. So it plays it with a lot of interesting stuff mechanically that will be neat to build around.
Yeah.
But I guess I should also mention that I've already built Little Pig. So
Little Pig towering over the Big Adventure.
Yeah, Little Pig's Big Adventure with Endless Helpless Souls and the Tower in the Sky, or something along those lines.
And what adventure is the Little Pig going on that it's seeing Eldritch Horrors?
I don't know, probably the thought of Little Pig in the big city.
Yeah, I guess the revelations are a metaphor for stuff that Little Pig is not used to.
Yeah, really, Little Pig is a social commentary on rural versus urban life. Where you see Little Pig is swept up with the endless helpless souls of the streets and the towering skyscrapers, much unlike their rural experience. And Little Pig must come back stronger than ever in his new adventure from the famous children's author.
Agent, I think we've talked for long enough, so that concludes the review.